In this folder, you've got an activity that's going to look at reflexes and how they work. And so before you get into that, I want to give you just kind of an introduction to reflexes and what they are. So here's a formal definition. They are rapid, predictable, involuntary responses to stimuli. One reflex that most of us are probably familiar with, that most of us have probably experienced at one time in our lives, is what's known as the knee-jerk reflex or the patellar reflex. And that's where when you're sitting down, the doctor takes that little knee hammer and they tap you just below the patella right here. And we all know that that causes, unless you've got spinal cord damage, your leg to kick out. So it's a rapid response that happens immediately on tapping. It's predictable, right? We know it's going to happen. We know what the outcome's going to be. And it's also involuntary. It happens whether you're thinking about it or not. So that patellar reflex and what we see happening with it is a good example of a reflex. It's rapid, it's predictable, and it's an involuntary response to stimuli. One of the things that you may not know that's kind of interesting, at least from my perspective, is that reflexes are actually there to maintain homeostasis in the body. So I want to give you maybe an example of this. If you think about eating something sour, even just thinking about it, thinking about putting a lemon in your mouth, a lot of times your mouth will start to produce more saliva. So you'll start to salivate. This is actually a reflex. And the reason that it's happening is when you eat sour things, they're really acidic and they drop the pH in your mouth. And if the pH in your mouth drops too much and it stays low for too long, it's really bad for your teeth and it can cause damage to the teeth. So we've got a reflex that increases production of saliva when you eat something sour, or even often if you just think about eating something sour, it's going to dilute that acid. And also your saliva actually has a buffer in it that's going to buffer that acid, so that very rapidly after you put something sour in your mouth that's really acidic, you can bring the pH back up to a normal level to protect the teeth. The patellar reflex is also an example of a reflex that's maintaining homeostasis. So what happens when the doctor hits just below your kneecap is he's hitting a tendon. And by doing that, it's stretching the tendon. And when the tendon is stretched, it's not going to be as good at stabilizing your knee. So we need to have those tendons in there kind of tight, working to hold everything together in the knee. If they're stretched a little bit, that's problematic because they're not going to be as good at stabilizing. So what happens is you contract your quadriceps, you pull that tendon back up into its normal position, and that stretch that was introduced into it goes away so that it can help to stabilize the knee and get the knee back to where it needs to be as far as stability to maintain homeostasis and prevent you from being injured. So that's kind of a quick introduction to reflexes, what they are, and how they help us to maintain homeostasis. One last thing that you should know about them before beginning your activity is that they are mediated over what's known as reflex arcs. So with this next slide, what I want to do is kind of show you what a reflex arc is and talk about them a little bit. So on this diagram, I have a representation of a reflex arc. Reflex arcs contain a few different components. So I'm going to point these out to you and talk about what they're doing as we go through this list of reflex arcs. So here we've got a picture of the skin. And you'll notice we've got a little receptor here and a sensory neuron that's taking sensations away from the skin to the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord here, and that's one thing that you should know about reflexes. They are mediated through the spinal cord, and that makes them happen very rapidly, because if an electrical signal just has to go to the spinal cord and back, it can move a lot faster than if it has to go all the way up to the brain and all the way back. So reflex arcs go through the spinal cord. Reflexes travel through the spinal cord. Here in the spinal cord, you'll notice we've got another neuron, and then we've got a third neuron in this pathway that goes out to a muscle. So with that kind of introduction to the pathway and the fact that these reflex arcs are just going through the spinal cord, I want to talk about what might happen if you were just sitting there minding your own business and somebody came up and stabbed you in the hand, okay, or somewhere in the skin with a pin or something like that. So if that happened, that sensation of damage being done to your tissues would be picked up by this first component of a reflex arc, which is known as a receptor. We would get an action potential developing because of the stimulus that happened that would travel toward the spinal cord. So because it's traveling toward the spinal cord, it's moving through a sensory neuron. Once the sensory neuron enters the spinal cord, there is a component of reflex arcs that may be there and may not be there. And I'll talk about why it may not be there in certain cases towards the end of this. For now, if you look at this second neuron here in the pathway, this is what's known as an interneuron. If they are present, they are always contained entirely within the CNS. So entirely in this case, within the spinal cord. This particular neuron has the role of kind of taking that information that you had this prick to this hand, it hurt, it's doing tissue damage, and planning an appropriate response to it. So the appropriate response in this case to avoid further damage would definitely be to jerk your hand away. So that interneuron is going to send a signal to a motor neuron. Remember, motor neurons are just neurons that are carrying electrical signals, action potentials away from the spinal cord. So here's our motor neuron, and electrical signals traveling down it, and that electrical signal is going to communicate with a skeletal muscle. So you could assume this is a skeletal muscle in the arm that when it contracts is going to pull the hand away so that further damage isn't done to it, so that the hand is protected. This muscle that's in charge of pulling the hand away is what's known as an effector. So I talked about the example of, for example, salivating, if you eat something really sour. In that case, the effector is the salivary glands. So in reflexes, the effector doesn't always have to be a muscle, but it very often is a muscle. So those are the major components of a reflex arc. I mentioned previously that interneurons are sometimes present and sometimes they are not. So here's what happens if an interneuron is not present. If an interneuron isn't present in a particular reflex arc, so I'm just going to cross this out like it isn't even here, what we'll see happening instead is that the sensory neuron will travel through the spinal cord all the way to the motor neuron, and it will synapse directly with the motor neuron. In some cases, we see this happening. So we see a reflex arc that doesn't have an interneuron, and here's why. If you don't have an interneuron, that reflex is going to be much faster than it would be with a neuron there. And the reason for that is every single time that we come to a synapse, remember that we have to convert our electrical signal into a chemical signal. The chemical has to cross the synapse, the neurotransmitter, bind to the next neuron, which initiates an action potential. And then here we have another synapse, so we have to convert that electrical signal into a chemical signal and back to an electrical signal. Everywhere that you have a synapse is going to slow down your signal. So if we have a reflex that we want to be incredibly fast, the best thing that we can have is a situation where there is no interneuron and the sensory neuron synapses directly on the motor neuron, because then we have just one synapse. We have just one area where that electrical signal has to be converted to a chemical signal and then back to an electrical signal. If you have a reflex arc like this one I've drawn in, where you've got a sensory neuron that's synapsing directly on a motor neuron, this is what's known as a monosynaptic reflex arc, because you've got a single synapse. If you have the case that we talked about initially, where you've got an interneuron, so you have a synapse here and a synapse here, and sometimes you'll even see multiple interneurons, so there's multiple synapses within the CNS. Those are what are known as polysynaptic reflex arcs, and they are slower. They do not move as quickly, again, because the more synapses we have, the more we're going to slow down that signal.